Hi guys, and welcome back. In this video, we will be doing a deep dive into the Hurricane Katrina case study. I have included some exam practice questions on some of the slides for us to see what kind of questions would be asked about the content we will cover. These questions will be answered in a separate video that will be linked in the description below, and that will also pop up as one of the suggested videos at the end of this one. The Hurricane Katrina case study video is the second in a series of videos that I'm creating to cover all the GCSE case studies. Please make sure that you're subscribed if you'd like to receive notification when they are uploaded. Also, let me know whether there is a particular case study that you'd like me to cover and that is not yet on the case study playlists. Okay, let's get started. Okay, so this is Hurricane Katrina's GIS cyclone track map. This map shows us the path of Hurricane Katrina and the areas that were most affected. So Hurricane Katrina started off as a tropical depression over the southeastern Bahamas on the 23rd of August 2005. So that is in this area here. You can see it's labeled as a tropical depression and it has started right there. And then on the 24th of August, it became a tropical storm and as it moved into central Bahamas. So this is central Bahamas here. And at that point now it was upgraded to a tropical storm. And that is when now it got its name Katrina, so Tropical Storm Katrina. As the storm continued to track west, it got bigger, making its initial landfall along the southeast Florida coast on the 25th as a Category 1. So that is in this area here. Now, that is when it's now initially classified as a hurricane. So over here, it was a tropical storm, but now it becomes a hurricane and it's now at Category 1. And the Category 1 hurricane is moving at 80 miles per hour on the Saffir-Simpson scale. Well, speeds in excess of 80 miles an hour. So it continued to move west across South Florida over the warm waters of the Gulf. Now, that is this area here. Now, because it's moving over water, and these are warm waters, it's likely to pick up a lot more moisture, and that moisture is going to feed the storm and cause it to get a lot bigger. And you can see that by the time it gets here, it actually becomes a Category 5 hurricane, and that is the highest it can get on the scale, on the Saffir-Simpson scale. So that's a very, very powerful hurricane. Okay, so it weakened to a Category 3, and a Category 3 has wind speeds in between 119 and 125 miles an hour, which is equivalent to 178 to 208 kilometers an hour. So that is still a significant speed. Those are wind speeds that are significantly high, and that was before it made its landfall, and that's in this area here. So it made landfall first in southeast Louisiana and then along the Mississippi Gulf coast. So you can imagine that at those wind speeds, making landforms around Louisiana, it had the potential to cause a lot of damage. Okay, so I've included an exemplar exam question here, and these are quite common in the exams, and it's good for us to be able to track a storm using a GIS cyclone track map and to know why it's useful. Okay, so the exemplar question reads as follows. So figure 2 shows a GIS cyclone track map. Explain 2 ways such maps such as this can help countries prepare for tropical cyclones. And this particular question is 4 marks. Now, these questions will be answered in a separate video so that we can carry on with the case study. What were the primary hazards caused by Hurricane Katrina? Now, primary hazards in this particular case here are referring to the hazards that were a direct or were caused directly as a result of the hurricane. And one of those is heavy rainfall and storm surge. Okay, so during Hurricane Katrina, the rainfall varied. So there were different amounts of rainfall in different areas, with the areas in Mississippi and Tennessee Valley receiving 4 to 8 inches, while areas closer to the coast got 5 to 10 inches. Now, you can imagine that if you're closer to the coast, that's where the hurricane is going to make its landfall, and therefore you're likely to get the bulk of the rain, really, and that's why the areas that were along the coast got a lot more rainfall. In fact, some isolated areas along the coastline exceeded 12 inches, which is quite a bit of rainfall. Then storm surges are a rise in sea level caused by the tropical storm or hurricane in this case. This led to a bulge of water along the coast, causing widespread flooding. Now you can see that this here picture is showing a tropical, a storm surge, and this is quite a lot of water to arrive at a coastline, especially a low-lying one. And an example, well, the storm surge here was actually up to 9 meters high, and an example of this is a 7-meter storm surge that devastated New Orleans, causing extensive flooding in the 9th Ward. Okay, so that's the first primary hazard. The second one were tornadoes. Now, Hurricane Katrina produced 33 tornadoes across a 5-day period, unfortunately killing 1 person and leaving a trail of destruction in their wake. Now you can see that there's an overturned car here, obviously as a result of a tornado. So they are quite powerful as well and can cause a lot of damage to homes, property, to homes and, buildings, infrastructure, and so on. And then the third primary hazard were strong winds. Now, whilst these strong winds here are not normally a direct cause of most deaths, they are actually reached speeds of up to 130 miles per hour. Now, that is pretty intense. And now we had said in the previous slide that a category 3 hurricane has winds that are between 119 and 129 miles an hour. So that's what is actually being reported here as well. And if you think about the speed limit on the motorway, it's only 70 miles an hour. So this is almost twice the speed limit on the motorway. So these are winds that are moving very, very fast. So they caused extensive damage to infrastructure, buildings, and vegetation along the Gulf Coast. Okay, and again here there's an exemplar exam question, and this time it's an 8 marker, and it reads as follows. Evaluate the view that strong winds are the most devastating hazard of hurricanes. Now, that question will be answered in a separate video, so that we can carry on with the case study. What were the impacts of Hurricane Katrina? Now, impacts are normally quite important, especially when it comes to answering 8-mark questions. So it's important to remember a number of impacts, maybe 6 or so from each category. Well, not from each category, but 2 from each category here. Now, I've categorized them under social impacts, economic impacts, and environmental impacts. Now, as far as the social impacts go, there was a death toll of 1,836 people, unfortunately. So that number of people died, okay, and then 150,000 homes were destroyed. Now, this here could also be considered as an economic impact, not just a social impact. It's a social impact because people were homeless as a result, but it could also be considered as an economic impact because those homes will need to be rebuilt, or those people will need to be rehoused. Okay, Then there were power outages. Now you can imagine the strong winds must have destroyed the power lines, okay? And this obviously affected the quality of life and of people, obviously, because they did not have electricity. But again, this could be categorized as well under the economic impacts, because if you think about businesses that do not have power, then they can also not be able to operate. So that can go into that category as well. And sometimes actually we categorize a lot of them under socio-economic impacts. So not separately, but socio-economic impacts. Okay. Then the next one is that over 1 million people were homeless. Now, the government set up the Superdome Stadium to house the homeless, but there were food shortages and conditions were unhygienic. So if you were discussing the case study, you'd be talking about the fact that yes, these people were housed, but one of the counter arguments that you can use there in terms of a negative of that accommodation that was provided is that the necessities, the basic necessities were not necessarily very well provided. So things like food and water were not very well provided to the people. And as a result, it's a criticism. And also the conditions were unhygienic. Now you can imagine there are a lot of people in there, and obviously that's unhygienic. Then the next social impact is that there was a population decline and there was displacement of people. So over 1.3 million people, so that's 80% of the people that were living in this particular area here were evacuated. However, obviously, some of the poor and old elderly people were left behind. And they were left in very poor conditions, exposed to waterborne diseases. Now, the water that had flooded the area obviously had mixed with other unpleasant substances that then could spread disease quite easily. So diseases such as cholera and so on. And there were also food shortages for the people that were left behind. Obviously, the shops were likely to have been closed, and the businesses are shut, so people cannot buy food. Neither can food be delivered that easily because there are flood waters and so on. So again, another social impact: health concerns due to the contaminated flood water. We had talked about that, and then there was an increase in crime as well. So looting and other crimes led to tensions in the city of New Orleans felt unsafe. Okay, so that again is a social impact when there are tensions within a particular area and people do not feel safe. Then, as far as the economic impacts are concerned, the infrastructure damage was estimated at over $125 billion. Now that's a lot of money because it was actually the costliest hurricane in the USA. And then the second impact was that there were collapsed levees. So levees are embankments that protect areas from flooding. Okay, now those embankments are sometimes made from concrete, and the ones that had been made here actually ended up collapsing. And because they collapsed, they then caused a lot of flooding. Now, one of the problems with collapsed levees or levees that collapse is that the water will initially build up behind them before it then breaks them. So that buildup of water initially before they break is quite a problem, because when they break, then there's a huge deluge of water that is then spread into an area. And if it's an area that has infrastructure and people's homes and so on, then that is a recipe for disaster. Okay, so that left 80% of New Orleans submerged for weeks. And the collapsing also unfortunately led to people drowning. Then we have a third economic impact here, and that is that businesses were affected. Now, a lot of the businesses actually closed for good and relocated to other parts of America. There was also an increase in crime where obviously businesses were being looted, and that led to loss of money for those businesses, and obviously must have affected the GDP of those particular areas. Okay, moving on to the environmental impacts. So we had oil spills actually, So the oil spills were damaged. Well, 44. There was damage to 44 oil factories that led to oil spills, releasing oil that contaminated water supplies and affected coastal ecosystems. There's a bit of spelling mistake here. Yeah, so so they contaminated water supplies and affected coastal systems. Then there was tree loss. There was tree loss. Now, as we had mentioned earlier, the strong winds actually felled trees. Okay, so they uprooted trees. Okay, and then there was beach erosion. And if there is beach erosion and sand is being removed from the coastline, it means that those coastlines are no longer well protected from coastal erosion, because the beach is normally your first line of defense from coastal erosion. So this just created a lot more problems. And then flood water was contaminated with household hazardous waste, pesticides, and heavy metals. Now this obviously is an impact to the ecosystem and the ecology of the area. So is an environmental impact. Okay, so we'll move on to the next slide, where there's an exemplar exam question, because I could not fit it in here. So for the impacts, we have two exemplar exam questions. One is a 4-marker and another one is an 8-marker here. And the 4-marker is to explain one social and one economic impact of a weather hazard in a developed country. Then the second question here, that is the 8-marker, is using named countries, evaluate whether the impacts of atmospheric hazards on emerging or developing countries are greater than those in developed countries. Now this obviously is a comparison between LICs and MICs, LICs and HICs, excuse me. Now in saying that, we have also covered, I have made the video for Tropical Cyclone Aila, which is a really good comparison that you can use to compare to Hurricane Katrina. And we will be answering these questions in a separate video so that we can carry on with this Hurricane Katrina one. Okay. How does the USA manage hurricanes? So we are going to be talking about how they predict them, how they prepare for them, and how they protect against them. And as far as prediction is concerned, the first way they use to predict them is by use of satellite technology. So this is a system launched into orbit around the Earth. And weather satellites have sensors to collect atmospheric and oceanic data. They gather information on cloud formations, temperature, wind speeds, and so on. And this provides a real-time view that then helps to predict and track the weather. You remember we had that cyclone track map that we looked at initially for Hurricane Katrina when we started this video. Now that is how satellites are the way in which information is gathered to be able to come up with that cyclone track map. Now the USA, being a rich country, has an abundance of satellites. So they have over 20 satellites. And tracking of Hurricane Katrina's path in the final 48 hours was remarkably accurate. Despite the storm rapidly intensifying in the Gulf of Mexico, as we had mentioned before. So they were fairly accurate in their tracking. The overall tracking of the storm provided approximately 56 hours of advance warning. So that is more than 2 days, which is sort of sufficient time to get people to evacuate an area. So so approximately 56 hours of advance warning about the imminent threat to Louisiana and Mississippi. This led to 80%, 1.3 million people being evacuated out of New Orleans alone. This arguably helped reduce the death toll. However, some of the satellites, the American satellites, are old now and need updating. So that's a criticism that can be used there. But overall, this is a really good system that they use to predict the hurricanes. The second way of prediction that the USA uses is weather forecasting. And this refers to predicting future weather conditions using satellite information, radar, ground stations, and weather balloons. The data is then analyzed using computer models and used to predict what the weather is going to be like. And again, that kind of information is also useful for creating the cyclone track map that we had talked about earlier. Now, weather forecasts are frequent in the USA, and almost everyone has access to a radio, TV, and a mobile phone. And that helps to disperse or to get information out there to people, so that if they need to evacuate an area because of a pending hurricane, they can do so. In 2025, there are 116.27 phone numbers per every 100 US citizens. So everyone in the US pretty much has a phone. So it's easy for them to be reached, especially if we are talking about text messages through mobile phones to warn people of an impending hurricane. This means that warning the population of an impending hurricane, is a lot easier and faster than in a developing country or LIC such as Bangladesh. Now, Bangladesh here is the comparison, the LIC that we are going to be using to compare, to make comparison to the USA. So that's important for us to note. So how does the USA prepare for hurricanes then? So we have talked about prediction. So predict, prepare, and protect. So preparation. Now they have warning and evacuation systems. And the USA has identified areas such as Florida that are at risk from hurricanes. Now, I'd like to mention something here. So identification of areas where you're likely to get hurricanes is very important. And how do we do that? Using the cyclone track map. Because if you look at the track of a cyclone, the one that we had looked at earlier in at the start, that map will tell you what path tropical storms are likely, or hurricanes are likely, to take in the future as well. So they are quite important in that way. And in an examination, when you're asked about the significance of a hurricane track map or cyclone track map, you can then say that it will help you know areas that are likely to be affected by future hurricanes or future tropical storms, so that you can prepare. And that is what the USA does. They prepare using such information. So these risk zones have warning and evacuation systems in place. So the preparation is you put those systems in place before in anticipation of future hurricanes, and in so doing, you're prepared such that you're not caught off guard, or people are not caught off guard, and therefore, they can move out in good time. Okay, and that will reduce the risk from a hurricane. Now, an example of that obviously is the fact that 1.3 million people were evacuated, and that was 80% of New Orleans. And that was a good thing because that averted a lot of potential casualties from that particular hurricane. However, a criticism is that some people were still left behind. We did talk about the elderly that were left behind, and the ones who were really poor to leave the area. Those ones were left behind. The National Guard was also mobilized to restore order and to assist recovery. However, the overall response to Katrina, particularly at the federal level, faced heavy criticism for its slowness, ineffectiveness in reaching all vulnerable populations. Okay, so at the federal level here is referring to the national level, in the context of the USA. The government as a whole was slow in responding, and that is a criticism that could be given here. Actually, during Hurricane Katrina, there were there were people who were waiting to be evacuated for quite a long time, and that is because the federal decisions at the federal level were taking a little longer to make, and there were a lot of delays. Okay, so there were also issues with providing adequate supplies and medical care in designated shelters such as the Louisiana Superdome. Okay, we had mentioned that earlier, and again, that is a criticism that could be used when you are either assessing or evaluating the management of Hurricane Katrina. So how does the USA protect against hurricanes? Now, we've talked about prediction, preparation, and now protection. And they protect vulnerable areas using flood defenses. Now, Hurricane Katrina was one of the costliest hurricanes in history, and it tested the protections in place to the limit. The river levees, so embankments that were, or walls that were in place, are destroyed by the storm surge, leading to flooding of New Orleans. Now, poor government spending was actually on maintenance was actually blamed for the inability of these defenses to cope with the storm surge from Hurricane Katrina. So if you were discussing this particular hurricane in an 8-mark exam question, for example, you talk about the fact that the USA has flood defenses in place. But then if you are talking about Hurricane Katrina, you'd say that a criticism, however, is that those flood defenses the government had not spent enough money, maintaining and repairing those flood defenses before Hurricane Katrina took place. And that could be a reason why they got breached or damaged during Hurricane Katrina. However, lessons were learned from the breach of those flood defenses, and being a HIC and having the money to spend on protection meant that a year later, all the flood walls had actually been restored, and they were restored to a better standard in order to be able to cope with future hurricanes that may present themselves. Now, the US government is also investing in cheaper soft engineering methods. Now, the flood walls are hard engineering, which is where you put physical structures to prevent against, storm surges, okay, or flooding from rivers, okay. But then, if we are talking about soft engineering methods, you're not necessarily putting any structures in place. Instead, in this case here, the US government is using beach nourishment, which is where you add more sand to the coastline, so that sand can act as your first line of defense. Now, we did see earlier in the video that a lot of beaches were actually destroyed and depleted of sand during Hurricane Katrina. Now, that obviously left those coastlines exposed not only to the cyclones, hurricanes in this case because it's a USA, but also to coastal erosion. So one way to protect these areas is using beach nourishment, and that is basically adding more sand to those beaches, because that sand will then act as the first absorbent of any water that is going to be coming into that particular coastal area. So it will act as your first line of defense. Then they also have created wetlands. Now, an example of a wetland is the one that you can see in the picture here. And obviously, this area has some water in it and has the potential to take more water, okay, without any damage to anything around it, because it's just a wetland. And if you have such wetlands in place as well, they are going to definitely protect coastal areas from the storm surges and from any other type of coastal flooding that may take place. And then they have also created artificial islands, okay, which do something similar as well. Now, on to the exemplar exam question here. This is an 8-mark question, and it says assess the success of different methods of cyclone management in a named developed country. So in this question, we would be discussing how successful we think the management of Hurricane Katrina was, because this is a developed country that we are being asked about here. Now, I did mention that these exam questions are going to be answered in a separate video. That brings us to the end of the Hurricane Katrina case study. I hope that you have found the information useful. I have had requests for various case studies and will be creating videos for as many of them as I can. You can find them in the case study playlist section. I have already posted the Cyclone Aila case study video, which can be used for comparison to Hurricane Katrina, LIC versus HIC. Also, the exemplar exam questions that were in this video and the Cyclone Aila video have been answered in a separate video, which will be linked in the description and will also be available in the exam practice playlist. Please do not hesitate to send me any questions, comments, or requests for a particular case study in the comment section below. All the best and see you again soon.